Welcome to another episode of Tomes and Tunes. I am Arielle Silver, an East Coaster living on the West Coast. I am a songwriter and a book lover, and I teach creative writing as well at Antioch University. And this is my show where I get to get completely nerdy about all the nerdiest, wonderful, nerdiest things with other songwriters from around the world. This week, my guest is fellow Californian, actually native Californian, songwriter Mike Berman, and we are gonna swap some songs and talk some books, and who knows what else we are gonna talk about. Welcome to the show. It is episode 96, and I'm gonna bring Mike on right now. Hi, Mike.
Hi, thank you, Arielle. So nice to be here with you.
Long time no see.
Yeah.
Mike and I have been getting together for the last 2 weeks or a couple weeks and talking about music and just getting nerdy off screen, on screen for us because it's all Zoom, but not broadcast. And so this is fun to have you on the show in this way. Now, we met in a song circle on Zoom.
That's right.
Right? Because that's like the, sign of the times. It's just the.
As far as I know, we've never been in the same physical space at the same time. Although I wouldn't be surprised if we were at some point. We just don't remember.
Yeah, that is very true, both parts of that. But I am very certain that in the future we have same room in 3D.
Absolutely.
Physical space. I'm sure that's going to happen. In fact, that might happen for like an album release party or something like that.
Could be.
Could happen.
Hopefully before that.
I hope so too. But you're recording an album, and
I am.
I'm curious if you would be so kind if we could talk about that a little bit, because here we are in the third year of the pandemic. COVID, unfortunately, has not gotten the memo from the CDC and the EU that COVID is over. So COVID, as far as it's concerned, is still happening. So in my book, we're still in a pandemic, unfortunately. And this has been a really strange time, 3 years now of this. And so are these songs that you're recording, they were all written during the pandemic, is that right?
A couple of them were written maybe in the year before. They're all written in the last 3 years, but the majority were written in 2020, 2021. And of course, then you start recording your album in 2021. You figure you'll do all your songs from then, and then you do your new songs. And of course, I have lots of new songs now.
Yeah.
Since then, because as you know, and the folks on here who have done this process before, it always takes a little longer than you think. But
yeah, absolutely. So how did you select the songs? This is a piece that I'm very interested in. I was reading, all songwriters do this differently, right? Like some songwriters write for the album, and the 10 or 12 songs that they have written are the songs that they wrote for the album. They're meant to live together on an album. Other songwriters will write, a handful of songs, 20 or 30, and select from that. And others will just, write like mad, 100 songs, and say, okay, we're going to cull through this. So what was your process?
so for me, it may not look like it to look at me, but I'm kind of a young songwriter. I mean, I've really only been um, dedicated to the craft and committed to being a songwriter really for the last 3 or 4 years. And it's grown and grown to where it's become all consuming for me in a really wonderful way. But
Yeah.
um, it really emerged. There is very much a theme to what I'm putting together, and you and I talked about this before. We're not exactly the same generation, but we both come from a time when the album was very important.
Yeah.
And so I thought about, okay, if I'm going to go in and record, originally I was thinking I would do an EP. I was thinking I would do about 5 songs, and they were very tightly tied to different aspects of my life in Los Angeles. And originally it was going to be called Both Sides of the Five, which only makes sense if you live in LA. And I realized later I probably should use something that would translate better than that. But you sort of have to be from here to you get that immediately, but someone from somewhere else is like, the five what?
Yeah.
And why is it the 5 and not 5?
Right.
Anyway,
That's endless conversations online about that
yeah,
one. I saw a whole Twitter stream a couple of weeks ago that was
yeah.
like,
So, but for me, it's the 5, and I grew up on both sides of the 5. I lived in San Gabriel, Monrovia. I lived in Mar Vista, and now I'm living in Alhambra, which is back on the east side of Interstate 5. So it's kind of the tracks in LA in some sense. And I had 5 songs that were really all pretty tightly related to that theme.
I see why you would want there to be 5 songs
Yeah.
on this album that
Well,
was
that seems about right for an
thematically about
EP.
the 5. Yeah, but if it's about the 5, then it's like, yeah, okay.
Yeah. But then once I started going, it kind of expanded. There were other songs that I felt had a resonance and that I would want to use. Since this is my first really serious foray into presenting myself as a musician, I thought about what is it that I want to say about myself. And so it expanded somewhat, and not all the songs are directly related to that. But to me, it's not certainly not a concept album. It's not the rock opera of growing up in LA. But maybe I'll do that next. But
Yeah.
they're all have some real deep personal connection to me. Um, they're all true, but that doesn't mean they all happened. And
Don't let the truth get in the way of good story.
don't let the truth get. A good song is better than a nonfiction song.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
but
Emotional, yeah, sometimes getting to that
but
most.
they all have the emotional truth, and they're all
Exactly.
personal to me. And
Yeah.
and so I just got going. I was like, I couldn't limit it to 5. I wanted to do more, and then I figured, well, I'm going to be going into the studio. I'm going to be hiring musicians.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and do what turned into be a dozen songs.
Yeah.
And they were all the last one I wrote is called "Living on Both Sides of the 5," after which I wrote after I started recording it. So that one was written about 6 months ago. So there, but most of them were written in 2020 and 2021. I had a couple for before that I wanted to include.
Well, why is this idea of living on both sides of the 5 or living on one side and then moving to the other? What is that about?
Well, I have this deep connection to where I live, and I think part of what I want to talk about to people, both who are here and so many like yourself who've come here, and people who maybe don't know LA, they know it from TV or something. I just want to tell a story that it's more complex and more interesting than the stereotypes about what Southern California is, and the sun and the beach and the beautiful people. And
Yeah.
that certainly wasn't my experience growing up. Although I touched on it, I knew the surfers, but I wasn't the surfer.
Yeah.
And then as I grew and as my understanding and appreciation of the city grew, I realized that it wasn't all white, that it wasn't all middle class or rich, that there are so many lives going on here, and I'm fascinated by many of them. And also there's this complex history, which we might get into later. It's sort of, people almost imagine it started with Hollywood. And then they see, oh, there's these things called missions. What's that about?
Yeah.
And then maybe if they dig enough, they find that there was something here before the missions. I mean, there were people living here for a long time. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of really fascinating history and culture, not just in the sense of movies and music and museums, but there's just the culture of the people, the food, the language, the 100 different languages that are spoken in Los Angeles, which I just love. And so it's all of that. And so that's why people who see Los Angeles as, Santa Monica to Beverly Hills or something like that, that's part of Los Angeles, but it's just one like tiny piece of it. And there's just the San Fernando Valley and the San Gabriel Valley and East Los Angeles, which is right by where I live now, and in places like Glendale and Pasadena that have complicated and sometimes shameful histories, but really interesting, and all the people who've to fought to make this a better place. So
Yeah.
I'm interested in all of that.
I like that word that you just used, complicated. I feel like that's where truth lies, and that's where interesting stories
Right.
lie. And it's easy in the narrative that you're talking, the pop culture narrative of Los Angeles. It's simplified
Right.
frequently, and when things are simplified, you and I were talking about this earlier. That idea of perfection versus wholeness, and
Hmm.
when we talk about perfection, a lot of times we're kind of like, well, this little piece doesn't seem to connect to these other pieces, so let me just smudge that out, let me
Right.
just erase that, and this other piece doesn't either, so let me erase that, and it becomes simplified, which loses its sense of wholeness.
Yeah, I mean, I
And
think
so
there's
what
the
you
richness in all the lives that are lived here.
right.
I mean, and there's
And when you're using that word rich, you're talking about like depth of flavor and
emotionally
sound
rich.
and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and the sounds, not
Yeah.
it's not just the Beach Boys, it's ranchero music,
Yeah.
and it's the blues and jazz and the incredible. I mean, most people don't know that Central Avenue in Los Angeles was one of the most important centers for jazz in America, right? You don't hear that much about that.
No, you don't.
And so there, I mean, there's an incredible music history, and for me, yeah, it's the Beach Boys and the Byrds and the Mamas and the Papas. It's all that. Um, but it goes much deeper, more complex, and those people were hearing those other kinds of music, and in funny ways, they were coming into what they did that aren't always obvious, but sometimes when you listen carefully, you can hear it.
Yeah. I've been listening lately to the audio book called Miracle and Wonder, which is Malcolm Gladwell's interview with Paul Simon
Yes.
over many, many months.
Hmm.
Have you encountered that?
I
Have you
did.
listened
I,
to that?
I listened to that, and
Yeah.
we could talk for a long time about Malcolm Gladwell, again, who I have a
We
complicated relationship
oh,
with, but and Paul Simon, but it was very interesting, and the story about a boy in Queens and
yeah.
absorbing all the culture on him. Well, I wouldn't necessarily compare myself to Paul Simon, but I think in that sense it is something similar, coming from kind of a middle class family, but just being in a place where the music is around you.
Yeah.
Maybe it comes in a little differently because it comes in over car radios rather than
Mm,
walking down the streets in
right, the
Queens,
doo-wop, right.
but it's there, and it's
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah, in the book, Malcolm Gladwell is trying to understand how is it that Paul Simon, he's really grappling with the question of cultural appropriation
Hmm.
and the idea of living in a postmodernist world where you have so many layers of cultures kind of mashed up together and trying to understand how all of this came together with in Paul Simon's music, and you're kind of describing the same thing about Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Like, it is not, it's not only what Hollywood has depicted in the films, and it's not only what a certain slice of pop culture narrative is, but I want to just say that I'm thinking right now about the organization Folk Alliance International. The conference starts next
Hmm.
week, and so it's been top of my mind. I'll be going to Kansas City and going to the conference. But one of the things that I have I'll say one of the positive things that I've gotten out of Folk Alliance and their programming is, for me, it has increased my awareness and my interest in learning more about whose land this was before it was settled by Europeans moving west, or whose land this was, and the indigenous people who called this home before the Europeans came,
Right.
maybe before, I mean, I always think about how, we're basically living in Mexico, like this was Mexico.
Hmm.
So I think about that a lot. But I'm curious, since you have spent your whole life here and I'm a relative newcomer, have you encountered much? I know that it was the Tongva and the Gabrielino tribes that were living right here where I am. Do you know much about those groups?
I've done some research to try to learn about it. It's certainly not much you learn in school here.
Mm, yeah.
It's and it's kind of presented in a way that I think if you're a perceptive kid, you're sort of like leaves you definitely with more questions than answers. It's sort of like, well, you know, when the white folks came here, there were people living in their simple huts and fishing,
Yeah.
and then there were missions, and then fast forward, now we're here. It's like,
Right.
where did
right,
they go,
right.
right?
Yeah.
No one talks about that.
Right.
And so I've certainly am interested in reading about that and learning about it. And
Yeah.
it's, you know, it's pretty sad and ugly. It's not a nice thing to read about, and it's
Yeah.
not something that's easy to present in third grade, where you build a mission out of sugar cubes, you know, if you go to school in California. So, but living on, but the clues are around you once you start looking.
For sure. Yeah.
Right. So it is something that I feel an obligation to and a desire to know more about it.
Yeah. Well, maybe this is a good moment for a song.
Sure.
Since you're talking about being this album is songs inspired by this place that you've lived.
Yeah, and this is actually one that I wrote that's not on the album, but it's very related to the album, and that was in two ways. We're going to talk about books later, but I was reading the 1619 Project book that came from the newspaper article Expanded.
Yeah.
And one of the things that struck me, and one of the things that makes it controversial, and when you say this, you go, why should this be controversial? And yet we know it is. There's no plantations in this book. There's forced labor camps. Okay, so that's a shift. That's shifting the frame.
Sometimes just a word shift is.
There are also no slaves. They're enslaved people.
That's right.
Which
Yeah.
is an action, right? Somebody did that. Right?
Yeah.
Enslave is an active verb.
Yeah.
It's not something they were. It was something that was done to them.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking about that, and as you know, I'm recording over in San Gabriel, which is hence the name. The Gabrieleño Indians comes from the San Gabriel Mission. They didn't call themselves Gabrieleños, of course. And I'm driving over there, and I go right by the San Gabriel Mission. And so I was thinking about plantations, and I was thinking about missions, and I was thinking that, well, mission sounds great. Like, what's your mission statement? Or a mission is like you're going forth to do something really good. So this is a really positive name that we call them, but we call them missions. And in an earlier rendition of this song, I had the line forced labor camps. I said, we call them missions, but because we don't call them forced labor camps. But I saw when I sang it to people, it was like they almost winced. And it was just like it was too strong for a song, right? It could be in an essay, but it was just too strong for a song. So I softened it a little bit, but hopefully people think about it. And not long after that, I read an interview with Jackson Browne. He was talking about writing songs that make a political point. He said, sometimes if you make it too strong, people just stop listening. So you have to be a little subtle. So this is what it became. There were people here, not so different from you and me. They love their families. There were people here, and they walked these hills, feeling the same sun in the afternoon, marking their days by the sight of the moon. There were people here, and we call them missions, the name given by the ones who came, but the ones who built them, we don't even know their names. And they built their homes upon the same land where I live today. So many died, so many ghosts that stay. these people here. There still are people here. Seems there are debts we could try to pay. Still we mostly look the other way. There were people here. And the generals, they took the land and took the water. Captain Fremont led the slaughter. We don't talk of that today. There were people here, not so different from you and me. They love their families. There were people here. There were people here.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm 3 blocks from Fremont Boulevard. You know, there's been a reckoning around Junipero Serra and a lot less idolizing of him and what he did. And there was the toppling of his statue in L.A. in the midst of the George Floyd protests. But we haven't talked about Captain Fremont, man. He was a notorious killer of Indians, as they called it at the time. And but we got Fremont everything in Southern California. Got Fremont Avenue, got Fremont Elementary School over there. There's the town of Fremont. And yeah, he was a bastard.
Wow.
So.
And I don't know the history of this area well enough to know any of that.
He brought
Thank
the
you.
bear flag to California. So when you see the California flag, it's got a bear on it. That
Yeah.
was his symbol.
Huh. Thank you, Mike. You know, the trouble with complicating things is that it disrupts comfort, right? And so a lot of people want to hold on to the comforts of their childhood home, for example. You know, where they come from. You know, they have a hard time reconciling the love or the warmth or the unknowing, the ignorance, the innocence. You know, there's that moment where if you learn something, learning by definition forces you out of what you know into something that you didn't know before but now know.
And that's why we're fighting over what's taught in school.
Yeah.
Right? Is exactly why.
Yeah.
And I'd like to think we can. I don't think we have to walk around feeling sad and guilty all the time just because we're reconciling
I
what
agree. Yeah.
was done in our name.
Yeah.
Because it's there. It's
Yeah.
there whether we recognize it or not. So I don't. But obviously, different people have real different opinions on that.
Yeah. Well, I think that some people don't know how to. They don't know how to continue walking with their head held high as they might have before, knowing this other piece. You know, I've known a lot of, for example, to kind of step into another demographic. I've known a lot of white men who have said, you know, I'm sorry for who I am, and you know, we all have to just be who we are, but to know. You know, the difficulties that the demographic that we come from, whatever it is, you know, to know that history, and so not to perpetuate the toxicity or the harm or whatever has been happening, and perhaps even go a little bit out of our way to help other people.
I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll take another, since I'm so fascinated by LA history, I'll just take another more recent thing, which is the water that came from Northern California that still flows from Northern California. So I was just reading about the Owens Valley indigenous people there are suing to try to get a change in how we in Los Angeles use that water that we own.
Yeah.
We bought the rights.
Yeah.
If you walk in the Sierra Mountains, you can find pump houses that say Los Angeles Department of Water and Power on them, up in the 5 miles from the nearest trailhead.
Yeah.
So we bought that water. We own it.
Yeah.
We ship it down here, and meanwhile, a vibrant ecosystem dried up. So what's our responsibility?
That's right.
I think it's to try to make that better, and
Yeah.
that might mean that we have to figure out how to use even less water than we use now.
Yeah.
Or we can say, no, we own it. They're just complaining.
Yeah. Yeah, the water rights issue is huge, especially out here in the West.
Yeah.
And, in general, the wealthy, whether it's a wealthy person or a wealthy nation or, whatever it is, in general, the wealthy can, take or just takes, what should be or what has historically been distributed to others.
Yeah.
And take more than their fair share.
Yep. It's
Yeah.
a difficult conversation.
It is
and
difficult, yeah.
Because they're winners
Especially
and
for
losers.
those of us who live in Los Angeles, right?
Yeah.
Like, we want to turn on the tap and get the water.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's another conversation that I hear a lot about folks who do, their hearts are in the right places, right? They do want change. They do want fairness. They just don't want it on their particular street.
Yeah.
And they don't want it to disrupt their particular lifestyle.
Right. And they want to feel safe and whole.
Yeah.
I'm still idealistic enough to believe that we could all feel we could feel safer. Those of us who feel relatively safe now could feel safer if the rest of those around us felt safe and clothed
Yeah,
and housed.
right.
And
Yeah.
my
That's right.
father used to say, "There's no one as scary as someone who has nothing left to lose."
Mm.
And I'd like to think that we could. It kind of seems to kind of go in and out of fashion, but I'd like to think
Yeah.
that if
Yeah.
we could have fewer losers, then we could all enjoy the world better.
Yeah. That's pretty insightful from your dad.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mr. Berman. The elder.
Yes.
Gosh, there's so many things that we have just talked about, that territory that we have just trod through.
We could talk about something entirely different.
I want to go back to the song that you just played.
Sure.
So I'm trying to follow my
Okay.
my thread of thought all the way back. So we know what inspired the song. We know what the song is about. From a songwriting craft standpoint, from a writing of the song standpoint, can you trace back to where it started for you? Did you pick up your guitar? Did you write "There Were People Here"? Where was the very first seed of that
It was
song?
those words, "There were people here."
Mm-hmm.
That's
And
very much from that song.
did it have a "There Were People Here"? It kind of has a cadence to it, right?
Yeah.
There were people here. And you say it in the song exactly as you would say it
Yeah.
in conversation. There were people here. But did it have a melody when you there were people here?
No, I think I probably picked up my guitar, and for those you music nerds, I'm playing it in DADGAD, which has a particular sound to it,
Yeah.
particular tuning. It actually sounds vaguely Celtic.
Mm.
You get lots of nice sustained tones and sustained chords, and so it's a way I write often, and I thought it sounded nice. But I mean the basic verse is just 3 chords repeated, so it's pretty simple. But yeah, it came from that, and it was, as I said, literally, I think it probably was while I was driving and looking at the city, and maybe I saw the Mission, and I thought, you're on Mission. What does it mean you're on Mission Avenue, right, which runs through San Gabriel Valley and runs downtown? Well, that was the old. If you stand on Mission Avenue in San Gabriel, Alhambra, and you look to the east, it points right at Mount Baldy, right, and it's out of alignment with all the other roads. Why is that? It's because that's the ancient road that people walked to come from the east side of the valley to the, and by the way, there were people in Los Angeles before there was a Los Angeles. It wasn't just founded. There was a village there, and it was on a river, and people had to find their way. They lined it up with a mountain, right? Because they didn't have GPS, obviously, right? And so if you look at that road, it's like, why would somebody build a road at a funny angle like that? And why is that mission? Because it's mission because the mission is on it. But it was there long before the mission. So if you pulled up the asphalt and dug down anywhere, you would find artifacts of the people who were here. It's just that it's buried under so much asphalt and concrete that they just disappeared. 150 years ago, there were indigenous villages in Southern California, in San Gabriel, in the city of San Gabriel. There was a village near the mission, and basically people got forced out and killed.
150 years ago is not that long ago.
150 years ago is not that long ago. Yeah.
Yeah. You're reminding me of an Ani DeFranco song, a lyric from one of her early albums, and they discovered a slave cemetery there. May their souls rest easy now that lynching is frowned upon and we've moved on to the electric chair.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So what is the place for you in terms of being a songwriter and being someone who is interested in complicating the narrative, in understanding the complicated narrative of where you're from, and you having possession of the microphone, having the stage, having
I think I
having
grew
the
up.
ears.
Sorry to talk over you. I think I grew up feeling a little rootless.
Why is that?
My father grew up in the Bronx in New York. Met my mother in Ohio at Antioch College. Mentioned Antioch University. They have some common roots, I know.
They have roots, common
There
roots,
was a
but no
connection
longer
a
affiliated.
long time back, and came to California. Her parents lived here, but I always had this sense of the new, that there was no history, that this was a historyless place.
That Los Angeles was.
Los Angeles was a historyless place. I lived in a subdivision that was built after World War II, and it seemed like it went back maybe to Charlie Chaplin or something, was like where LA started.
Yeah.
And and my parents took me to missions. They took me to Alvera Street, which again is like a whole other story. Maybe I'll try to write a song about that sometime. But I was fascinated by the East Coast and where the Revolutionary War took place, and you could go to a house that George Washington lived in, or a battlefield for the Civil War. It seemed like that was rich with history, and that California was this kind of new, rootless place. Everyone was from somewhere else, and that it had just sort of sprung up like Athena, from a shell or something. I've probably messed up that metaphor, but it had just sprung up from out of nowhere, and people just came here and said, "Wow, this is a great place. Let's stay."
Yeah.
And so I think that
there's the mythology of the West,
Right.
the American mythology
The
that
open
leads
land.
you to
Right.
this is like the destination that.
Inconveniently, there were a few people there, but we sort of took care of that. So I think I think it was that sense of, and my families came from different places in Europe around the turn of the last century. Some were Jews, some were Christians from different parts of Europe. And I didn't feel a lot of connection with them. I didn't feel like I had any family traditions that were very strong. They had a little bit, but they felt very weak to me. And I kind of envied people like, oh, you're in an Italian family, you're in a Jewish family, and you can talk about your great grandparents and the history of the place, and whatever it was, whether it's a good history or a bad history, you have a history. And I felt a little. I don't think my parents both didn't have super happy childhoods, and I don't think they really wanted to look back very much. They wanted to look forward, and LA was always a place that was looking forward.
Yeah, it's kind of like a place for people in exile.
Yeah,
that they leave where they were from, so that they can, start something new.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
there was a time I lived in the East Coast for a while, and there was a time when a relative died. My father was visiting, and I was driving around New York City. And he was going like, "I can't believe people live like this." You know, he just wanted to get out.
Yeah.
And his father died when he was young. My mother had a complicated relationship with her family. So I think I've always felt a little rootless. And so at first I thought, well, I would go somewhere else and find it. And then I think it was going away. I realized, no, there's a lot there that I just don't know.
Right. Like dig
Um,
deeper.
Dig deeper and look at your own life and the people you knew and the things that you
Yeah.
did and try to understand. And I think it comes with age. I've lived so much of this history now. I feel
Yeah.
historical, And
Well,
I
yeah.
try to enjoy that rather than try to hide it or regret it.
You're making me think about my mom is a genealogist,
Hmm.
and she is a researcher, and she helps other people uh, understand their family tree, and to go back in generations. And you're kind of making me think that people lately, this has been a really big thing in pop culture, like
Yeah.
let's get our genetic test and find out that we're 1% Icelandic and whatever it is. And they're sort of like hop skip jumping over what is right there in front of them,
Hmm.
right? Like that they're searching, and maybe people are searching for some kind of roots because maybe we are living in a rootless time, or maybe in the U.S. so many of us are rootless, because it is a country in so many ways of people either coming here from somewhere else or being from here and being pushed out. So it's such a, maybe it's a rootless country in many ways.
Yeah, I think we have that. I think that's actually part of our mythology almost, right? It's just that
Yeah,
America, the place,
you can make yourself.
you
You
can
can,
the self-made man
yeah,
usually, um,
yeah,
and any if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere.
that's
And
right.
I think what's interesting about the whole genealogy thing and the DNA, which has its good and its bad sides, but I'm struck by how many people find out about family lies, right? It's like
Right,
really
that's
common
right.
for it's really common for people to find out, oh, their genealogy is much more twisted than they thought.
Yeah,
That who they thought was their grandmother wasn't really their grandmother, and
that's right.
or more likely
Yeah,
their
it seems to
grandfather.
be, anecdotally, it seems to be a 50-50 split. Some people are delighted they find out good news. Oh, a long lost cousin. And then the other 50% are, oh, I'm not my father's daughter, you
Right.
know.
Well, my mother passed away about 5, 6 years ago, and she asked me to do some digging about her father, who, and her father's background. He was essentially an orphan at an early age, or a foster child. And she said he always said, he had this English grandfather, and he always talked about being. Trying to think. I guess that he was German is what he would say. Well, I found out that in fact he was Hungarian, and as far as I can tell, all his ancestors were Hungarian. And I think it was the English thing, frankly, was a vestige of racism, right? It's like English is like good. That's like the superior class. You want to be English.
Mm,
Hungarian in those days was viewed as a pretty lower class kind of thing.
mm.
He didn't want to be Hungarian. He wanted to be English. Um, and but I
And
did
and
find a
if he was
really
in,
interesting story that I still haven't written about. But I'll just tell you this one quickly.
yeah,
This was the best thing that I found out. So I found out about my great grandfather, who I knew nothing about. He who was my grandfather. I said he became a foster child. His grandmother died. His grandfather left the family behind. They were in Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio. He went to West Virginia, became a tailor, and he was killed on the porch of a miner's hut in West Virginia at 2 in the morning in a fight. After he threatened to hit somebody with an axe, and they pulled a gun and killed him. So
hmm.
so I've got an interesting history.
That's Southern Gothic for sure.
Yeah, Southern Gothic from Hungary by way
Yeah.
of Cleveland, Ohio.
Well, my great grandfather's brother, my great grandfather and his brother both came over here from what was sometimes known as Romania, sometimes Ukraine, sometimes Russia, sometimes
Hmm.
like the borders would always change.
Right.
But they came over here, and the brother apparently moved down to New Orleans, and in his, I think, obituary, there's this wonderful story about how he went to medical school in Vienna, and he was a doctor from Austria, and here in New Orleans he co-owned a bookstore of some sort. Well, the truth is he never was a doctor. He didn't come from Austria. He never was in Vienna. He was a Jewish, poor Jewish boy who came over with his brother, and their last name somewhere down the line was Buchbinder. He belonged in the books. Yeah, the stories of America.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Maybe this is a great conversation, I think, to segue into the book that you have brought with you today for the show.
So I had read bits and pieces of this when it appeared in the Times and online. I think it's still, you can get it free online, the special section that they did. And as you can see, I'm kind of a history nut anyway, and so I wanted to read this. I got the book, and it's really wonderful. There's a lot to read in it. There's a lot of information. Sometimes it's, our history is painful, so you're reading some painful history. And I think of the fact that people have fought so hard over this book and who's allowed to read it really made me want to read it.
Yeah, if people didn't want people to read it, they should just not talk about it and let it slide into,
like everything else, right?
Yeah, being just forgotten.
Yeah,
world.
but huge props to Nicole Hannah-Jones for making this happen and being the leading force behind it. And
well, for those people who, so the 1969 or the 1619 project, 1969. There we go. 1619 project. So talk a little bit about the book as a whole.
So the date is when the first enslaved people were brought to America, enslaved black people. And I think a few of the themes of the book, as I would see, is first of all that sometimes slavery is presented as a kind of aberration. Like, we're this really great country that stands for freedom and democracy, which a lot of time we do. But we did make this one little mistake, which is that we had some slaves. But between Abe Lincoln and the Civil Rights Movement, we fixed it.
Right.
And that, so we can sort of say, and now we live in some people would like to say we live in this post-racial world. The thesis of this book is that the history of the enslaved people of America and the Africans who were brought here against their will is the history of America. It's like the most important thing about the history of America. It's what defines who we are. Good and
so instead
bad.
of marginalizing the story, putting it front and center, right?
Good and bad. And I'll mention, just as a musician, how can you be a musician in America and not believe that? Right? Yeah. There's no American music without Black American music. There just isn't.
Yeah.
There's only European music and music from other places.
Right. Which you could argue, the power of American music, that it had this mashup, going back to that like postmodern mashup of the European parlor music and what was happening there, and this other music that was happening coming from Africa. And one of them is, I think of the European music as being what is the word I'm looking for? It's like the European model brought melody and harmony, and the African model brought rhythm, and not exclusively on one side or the other, but those were major contributions of those two channels, and then they clashed here and created blues, jazz, country.
And another piece that we really don't understand was the contribution of indigenous music. There's a really good documentary, I think it's on Netflix, about Native American musicians in pop music. And Dwayne Eddy, the guitarist, was famously came from an indigenous background. And they talk in that, and you mentioned New Orleans, they talk about the convergence in New Orleans in particular of Black music, European music, and indigenous music. And some people really believe that really kind of the blues note in blues music comes as much from indigenous music as it does from African music. So, but you know, by looking the other way, we've lost so much of that history we just don't know, and it was swept under the rug. People are embarrassed of it. You know, it's a tragedy, but that's part of it too. So we can't even quantify what that is, but that's in there somewhere too. The indigenous music is part of American music too. But surely Black American music is the roots of is American music, right? Everything that's American jazz and rock and roll is so tied to black musicians, and so that's just the example. I mean, that resonates with me as a musician, but you know, the White House was built by black people. There's an irony for you, right? I mean, and so the forced labor camps, as they're described in this book, are just a key part of the history. They're so tied to the history of America. I think 10 of the first 12 American presidents had been enslavers, you know, or were when they were presidents, right?
Yeah. Is
so-
there a passage in that book that you
Sure.
could share?
I picked out this, which is near the beginning, and so this is the author of this essay, Nicole Hannah-Jones, the first essay in the book, Democracy, and she's talking about her father always flew the flag in front of the house, the American flag, and so she says, "When I was young, the flag outside our home never made sense to me. How could this black man, having seen firsthand the way his country abused black Americans, the way it refused to treat us as full citizens, proudly fly its banner? My father had endured segregation in housing and school, discrimination in employment, and harassment by the police. He was one of the smartest people I knew, and yet by the time I was a work-study student in college, I was earning more an hour than he did. I didn't understand his patriotism. It deeply embarrassed me." And she says, "Like most people, I thought I understood so much when in fact I understood so little. My father knew exactly what he was doing when he raised that flag. He knew that our people's contribution to building the richest and most powerful nation in the world were indelible, that the United States simply would not exist without us." So that's kind of how it starts off, and then there's just a lot to learn and a lot to feel from this book. So I'm very pleased to be working my way through it. I don't read as much as I used to. I think this just seems to suck up all your time.
Yeah, the scrolling of the phone.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. But so is the 1619 Project book a collection of essays written by different authors?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
But it's also has poetry and words of songs, and so each section starts usually with a poem.
So it's not
Has
it's not a
photographs.
strict history book.
No,
Okay, got it.
no, it's not a sequential history book. It's thematic. I mean,
Got it.
the section on fear is devastating by Leslie Alexander and Michelle Alexander. I mean, that chapter alone, if you just read that, it explains so much of what's going on right now in this country.
Thank you for bringing that in.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That's the first time that book has been brought to the show, so appreciate that. I am reading something, well, I am reading actually The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, and I brought that in last week. I've had a doozy of a week. I don't even remember what's happened in the last week since this show. I'm in the middle of recording my next album, so there were a lot of hours spent at the recording studio, and I'm sure that there were other things happening this week as well, but all I can say is I have not read as much as I would like to. So instead of bringing that book back onto the show this week, because I'm only a few pages further in, I decided to, for some reason, I found myself thinking about this book, Birds in Fall, by the writer Brad Kessler. He is a beautiful writer. He was one of my mentors when I was in grad school, and I refused to read his work while he was my mentor because I didn't want his writing to disrupt the development of my own voice as a writer. But after we got through our time together, and he was a generous and delightful mentor, after that I devoured whatever I could of his writing. And I've read this book several times. It's called Birds in Fall. It's a novel, very, very slim novel. And he recently, last year I think, came out with a new novel called North. And I did bring that onto the show when it was first published. And that book is, so Brad Kessler, the writer, is still a writer, but he lives in Vermont and he raises goats and he makes goat milk. And the book North, the novel that he published last year, is it brings three characters together, and one of them is a monk living in a monastery in Vermont. One of them is if I can remember correctly, I don't know if it was a Vietnam vet or just a veteran of the military in general, but this vet is, he works as the gatekeeper at the monastery. And the third person is this woman from Somalia. And she is escaping violence in her home country, extreme violence, and she is trying to make her way to safety. And somehow she makes her way to, I can't remember exactly where she lands. I think it's in South America, and then she has to cross through Mexico. And she's trying to get to the U.S., and this is during the Trump years. And it doesn't explicitly say it's the Trump years, but you can tell by the flavor of the book, the nature of the political climate in the United States that it is. And so she ends up getting into the States and living here for a short while. And I think I don't even know if she entered the United States. Maybe she just crossed the border and she was arrested. And she ended up spending, I think, some time, 6 months to 2 years, I can't remember exactly, in a prison of some sort. And when she finally gets out of that, she is able to make her way to Canada. And so in the book, she never actually crosses the border to Canada. The book ends before that happens, but you assume that she's going to be able to step across the line anytime now. It primarily takes place although it kind of braids these three people's stories, and so it takes place in part in their own personal histories. It also primarily takes place in this particular monastery in Vermont. And I had not realized that there was this, pretty vibrant, pretty vibrant community of folks from Somalia and some other places living in New England. But I had a guest on this show a few months ago, Jenny Von West, who lives in Maine, and she was able to talk further about that topic. In any case, this book, Birds in Fall, when was this published?
And I can hear the birds in spring behind you while you.
This book was published in 2006. So the inciting action at the very beginning of the book is there's a plane crash over, I believe it's Nova Scotia, and the first chapter is, if I remember correctly, takes place in the plane, the characters on the plane as the plane is going down. And then starting with the second chapter, it's no longer about those characters. It's about all of the people who come to this small town to find out what happened to their loved ones. And so it's there are a lot of books that are like this, where a bunch of strangers, for whatever random reason, end up in the same place at the same time, and how they get to know each other and what it reveals about their character and how it impacts their life going forward. And so that's what happens in this book. And so in this little passage, these characters are in this town, and they all have lost a loved one of some sort, and they don't know each other, and some of them are from Europe, some of these people are from the US, some of them are from Canada, and I believe that there's a couple, I think, from India. In any case, all these people from very different cultural backgrounds are suddenly coming together and drinking tea. And Anna, who is, I believe she's the primary protagonist of this story, she's talking in this passage. let's see if I can find here. So one of the characters is talking about birds getting caught in the engines of an airplane, or somehow like disrupting the flight. I don't remember if in this particular moment they're speculating like, why did this plane crash? But Anna took a sip of cold tea. She'd done a paper on just that subject once as an undergraduate. And she sat back now in the candlelight and told them how a hurricane was a kind of enormous whirlpool, sometimes 600 miles across, and that migrating birds were sucked into the spiral in a counterclockwise direction in the north, the way swimmers or scraps of paper were drawn into a strong current. Over the ocean, the eye of a hurricane could be as large as 50 miles wide, and sometimes migrating birds were pulled into the eye itself. Land birds traveling over the ocean got all mixed up with, I don't know how to pronounce this word, pelagic birds. The thing is, Anna explained, surrounding the eye is a wall of thunderstorms, shoulder to shoulder, and the wall can be as much as 5 miles thick. The birds who find themselves inside the eye of the storm are in a kind of sanctuary, she said, where the winds can be calm and the sun might be out, but it's an illusion, a vacuum. The ocean below is incredibly violent, with swells as high as 50 feet. Essentially, the birds are trapped there, inside the eye. One of the other characters relates how after a storm, she saw a brown pelican in her pool in northwestern Connecticut. It was amazing how it got there. A pelican, she beamed. Yes, Anna nodded. All the birds get mixed up and blown off course. That's why, this time of year, we get unusual fallouts. People sometimes find exotic species that technically shouldn't be there. It's great for birders, she explained, but bad for the birds. And one of the other characters asks, how do they find their way back? Anna turned to him. The others did as well. Who? She asked. The ones who get blown off course. No, Anna shrugged. They don't. Sometimes they hook up with another flock of a similar species. Cackling geese with Canada geese. A spotted redshank with a flock of yellowlegs. They're very forgiving that way, she said. Accidentals occasionally show up from across the Atlantic, British or European birds blown across the sea. They end up on a totally different continent. They seem to survive just fine. Accidentals? The Italian asked. Yes, Anna nodded. That's what they call them. The ones who shouldn't be there. And so I'll just leave it at that. So that's Birds in Fall from Brad Kessler.
That's very striking, and the funny thing that struck me was the two common meanings of the word accidentals as a noun, which is birds that are where you don't expect them, and musical notes where you don't expect them, or both accidentals.
Yeah, the like borrowing from another key, right? They don't
exactly.
belong to that tonic key.
Yeah.
Mike, you have your guitar.
I do.
And we're coming up on the hour. So how about we take it out with you playing a song? I'll finish up with me playing a song, and then we'll just call it that.
Well, I didn't want people to think that my album was all about what's wrong with Los Angeles or America or anywhere else. So this is very much a song from my life and really rooted in my time as a young man in Los Angeles and in the culture of driving around in your car. Yep. Drive till you find a freeway, the ocean or a mountain. Head east on Sunset Boulevard and double back on Fountain. And if you find you lose your way, you can consult my Thomas Guide. I would never leave my home with without it at my side. And there is hardly any reason for you to go downtown. The air is thick and brown and there's nobody around. The strip has tower records and Hollywood's nearby. We can stand outside the Tommy's with a side of chili fries. Drive. Backs against the hills, golden lakes sprawl in the sea, gasping as she draws the poison air into her lungs. She looks beautiful to me, and if you say she's just a freeway, you don't know her like I do. You've got to try out every exit as you go rolling through. And it surely doesn't matter if you never see the stars. It takes 1,000 miles just to find out who you are.
That's a fun one. And I love that line. It takes 1,000 miles just to find out who you are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll play a California song as well.
Great.
I have songs from that I think of as being oriented toward the different places that I've lived, but this one very much came out of being here and the idea that somehow we ended up crossing paths despite all the different roads that we have been down, and how strange it is that, I don't know, I just feel like a million things have led to two people just crossing paths, and when those two people actually get along, it's kind of, well, it's a miracle. So
kind of like the birds in the eye of the storm.
That's right.
That 50-mile radius that's churning.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So this is a song called Miracle. Ankle deep in the Pacific, I sink my feet into the foam, looking out on the horizon where the ocean touches the unknown. Hands and knees beside a tide pool, filling buckets for a mold, while my daydreams are drifting by. You've built a castle with a moat. Ooh, I call it a miracle. You call it unpredictable odds. And maybe I'm more Sense and Sensibility. Maybe you're more Star Wars and Disney spinning the teacups. Faster and faster, and I'm looking up for the belt of Orion. Beyond the circle of airplanes flying, you're up on LA Stars award show fashion. Ooh, I call it a miracle. It seems improbable, the chances, when I think of space and time. We'd even land in the same country. You say, what a lucky roll of dice. Ooh, I call it a miracle. And maybe I'm more Sense and Sensibility. Maybe you're more Star Wars and Disney spinning the teacups. Faster and faster, and I'm looking up for the belt of Orion. Beyond the circle of airplanes flying, you're up on LA Stars award show fashion. Ooh, I call it a miracle. You call it unpredictable odds. Maybe I'm more Sense and Sensibility. Maybe you're more Star Wars and Disney spinning the teacups. Faster and faster, and I'm looking up for the belt of Orion. Beyond the circle of airplanes flying, you're up on LA Stars award show fashion. Ooh, I call it a miracle. Call it a miracle.
Oh, that's really fine. And you win for getting Sense and Sensibility and Star Wars and Disney in the same couplet. That's awesome.
I know, Jane Austen would never have suspected that one, right?
Yeah, I love it.
Mike, it's so fun to talk with you like this after, we're talking about recording projects and all that stuff in our other conversations, but it was really great to talk about all this other stuff with you. So
thank you
for
so
being on the
much. It's
show.
such an honor for me, and as somebody, as I say, as a young singer-songwriter, in terms of being in the business, it's just hopefully a few people get to know me and they'll be interested in my album when it comes out. Probably I'm thinking around October, November. Hopefully be looking for some singles before that. But
Yeah.
I'm very excited about it. I'm excited for people to hear it, and I appreciate all the support and all the good advice that you've given and for bringing me on here. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I am glad for you to be here, and I'm gonna guess that if I were to ask you what's the best way for people to support you right now, you would say subscribe to my YouTube channel?
That's what I would say. Yeah,
Okay,
I think
I'm gonna
I
put
just
that in
got
the
it
chat box.
re-established a week ago, and the website's coming. But if you get to the YouTube channel, you'll get some content there, and then when the website is up, you'll be able to see it there and see the link to it. And I just really want people to listen. That's what I think. What an artist wants. They want to make art that's meaningful to them, and then they want to know it's meaningful to a few other people. So that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, really well said. Yeah, beautiful. You stay right there. I'm gonna kick you off in this unceremoniously terrible way, and then we'll say goodbye, a proper civilized goodbye in the green room.
Sounds
For
good.
now, okay. And thank you all for tuning in to another episode of Tomes and Tunes. Next week, I'm going to be in Kansas City at the Folk Alliance International Conference, and it is going to be a much smaller conference than it has been in the past, but still really beautiful. I'm anticipating a really beautiful Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 4 days, 5 days, something like that, of lots of music, hopefully everybody wearing masks so that we can all do it safely. And I hope to come back with some new inspiration. I'm sure I will. So that is all to say that next week there is no Tomes and Tunes. I'm sure that I'm going to be booking some of the artists that I bump into, though, for future Tomes and Tunes. So watch some of the archives, and I hope that you have a great week, 2 weeks. I will see you in 2 weeks' time. And until then, be safe and shower the people you love with love. Okay, bye-bye.